好，各位朋友，隔了一段时间，我们今天继续来看看萨克斯在GATE中心智库会议上讲话的第5段啊，也就是最后一段内容了。主要是讨论的中美贸易战方面的问题，还有中国的历史。坦率的说啊，如果我们的历史老师都能够像他这样给我们介绍中国历史啊，我肯定就不困了。这个谈话呢，还是先从西班牙开始的啊。
One of the most impressive parts of Spain's approach to the SDGs is the innovations of new kinds of dialogue. The People's Assembly that I learned about yesterday and didn't know about, which I really like a lot. The engagement of the government with tremendous amounts of discussion, regional discussions, a commitment to addressing lagging regions or places that are especially challenged, with a lot of dialogue and participation, I think is key. Yesterday, we had a long discussion about all the different ways of engagement, and it made me reflect, sadly, about the US scene, because we don't have any of those innovations taking place. But what you point out is very much part of the US scene. The rural areas are largely Republican and Trump country. The suburban areas are the contested regions, and the urban areas are overwhelmingly the Democratic Party regions. So we're really divided on the urban-rural divide. It's also in the US, it's a very big cultural divide. Division by religion, division by love of guns, division by many cultural things as well. But also, it's the rural areas suffer from absolutely the lack of public services. And when they declined over time in population, which they did, there was no compensatory or public service response. And in the US, when you lose your job, you lose your health care to an important extent. And that was also part of the decline of health in the rural areas that has been part of this. So I don't have any magic answer for this other than two basic points. One is a tremendous deliberative process, because that is the strong point of our democratic societies, and it keeps them democratic, is that kind of intensive dialogue and experimental ways like the People's Assembly. And the second is the socialization of major categories of consumption, meaning it's not even consumption, it's the wrong term, but in the accounts it's like that. Healthcare, quality education, basic infrastructure are state responsibilities. And if they are not handled by the state, then they just go into cascading decline. And that's the US scene.
这里呢，萨克斯就比较了西班牙和美国的情况。美国两党竞争呢，就是他们政党的主权利，甚至形成了一种特殊的文化，目前正在逐渐将美国人撕裂。美国从2战结束后获得了大量的战争赔款，一下子用不完的钱，从此美国人安居乐业。从1949年开始到1964年的婴儿潮，因为美国的经济发展提供了极佳的人力保障和后劲儿。目前你能够想到的美国最有成就的人物啊，大多都是那个时代的产物，有钱有人，这就创造了巨大的社会发展红利啊，让全世界这么多年来一直都误解啊，这是他们的制度优势。然后半个世纪过去了，虽然美国呢目前还谈不上是坐吃山空，但实际上肯定是大不如从前了。美国人如果失去了工作，照样生不起病，这样的情况呢已经很长时间了。萨克斯啊，至少并不认为美国在社会福利和社会制度上有多优越。他感受到的是美国是缺乏创新的。他说没有神奇的答案来解释这些问题。如果现在你对我刚才说的这些话有不同的看法啊，先别 急中反驳，请继续听下去。他后面对中国历史发展和现状的评价，会与我刚才说的话吻合起来。
Look, the U.S., as I said, is been on a very aggressive stance against China since about 2014. That was when the U.S. political class decided that China was becoming dangerous to U.S. hegemony or U.S. primacy. And probably the single event that triggered this was the Made in China 2025 policy, which was a government policy in China that said for 10 leading industries, we intend to become world leaders in these technologies. It included semiconductors, robotics, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, new forms of aviation, precision medicine, precision agriculture. And this scared American policymakers because China was going from being a workshop for Apple phones to being an innovator of its own. And at the same time, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, which was a perfectly sensible, outward-looking strategy to help develop infrastructure in China's near neighborhood and then more broadly. But suddenly this was seen also as a threat. That's something America used to do. You can't do that. Yeah. And so those two things triggered an American reaction. I watched it take hold in some detail. It was not any particular perfidious action by China. It was the sense that, my God, they're even larger than the United States in the IMF statistics now. So it was a fear factor. I called it a neurotic reaction. Then Trump's election in 2016, which was based on an anti-China rhetoric, alerted the Democrats too that this is good domestic politics, maybe vital domestic politics. We have to be anti-China like the Republicans. Otherwise, we'll lose the states of Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, the industrial belt where Trump won by narrow margins. So this is also a political strategy. It's not a very sophisticated strategy, but it is a political strategy. So between the deep state, which is aimed at American primacy, and not only in a metaphor, in every document, that's the American position, primacy. And again, not in an academic sense, it's in American strategic documents that we must be the dominant power in every region of the world, including Asia, plus the domestic politics led to a fulminant anti-China wave in the United States, to the point finally of starting to arrest professors that didn't properly fully declare their relations with Chinese universities and so forth. So something we're familiar with from American history in various times. Even MIT and Harvard professors being arrested, walked off campus in handcuffs. Unbelievable. And this is the mood right now. And our politicians, not very clever, not very sophisticated, not very brave, continue to play this. Our foreign policy team, very weak, in my view. And so they've been not only anti-China, but deliberately rude to China in every encounter. This is quite strange because the one thing that you should learn in day one of China Diplomacy 101 is be polite. That's actually a big part of statecraft for the last 2,000 years. But in the American handbook, it is not only take substantive positions, be rude. So when you meet your Chinese counterpart, put out your hand and say, Xinjiang genocide, Taiwan and Hong Kong, how do you do? That's American diplomacy. Antagonize the other side. Then announce every day, we will defend Taiwan. Who talked about a war except the United States saying every day, we will defend Taiwan? This is not calculated to arrive at a safe destination. I don't see anything changing right now. I don't find President Biden very supple or sophisticated. I don't find the foreign policy team up to the job. And I don't find our political class, either of the two parties, anybody saying anything contrary to the main line right now. And as elections come for November, that means nothing can change. And then after November, the next day begin the presidential elections of 2024. So that begins a new campaign, so nothing can change. So we're on some measure of dangerous path, either moderated because somebody knows to behave, or really dangerous, and also dangerous by accident because we scramble planes, they scramble planes, we don't necessarily have proper conflict avoidance modes operating at all times. Accidents could happen. We could have two fighter aircraft flying over the South China Sea hit each other. God knows some awful thing could happen. So we need prudence. That's the main word I would use, is we need prudence. But I don't know whether we have prudence. In the middle of all of this, for example, as everything's worsening, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, announces that she's flying to Taiwan. That's not prudent. That is provocative. Because we should just try to calm things down, not to stir up these crises right now. That's for Taiwan's sake first and foremost. It is for China, it's for us, it's for the world. We didn't do any favor to Ukraine cheerleading for Ukraine in 2021 rather than seriously discussing issues with Russia. And that, I fear, in Asia, we have the same approach right now, which is to stir things up rather than to be prudent.
他这里面说出了中美争端的根本问题：中国制造2025，要成为新技术的领导者，这是一个国家发展的正当要求。一带一路倡议这种外向型战略是美国过去常做的事啊，但不允许中国做。然后不管是民主党还是共和党，为了选票，不得不表现出反华的姿态。在美国现有体制下，甚至挑不出名字的政客啊。拜登和特朗普竞选的时候，许多人只是因为讨厌特朗普而不得不将选票投给拜登。没想到拜登给美国带来的麻烦果然不小啊！一个历史不长的国家连基本的外交礼仪也不懂，更不用说懂得中国过去2000年的治国方略了啊！然后美国几十年来呢，还是惯用的各种挑衅，让萨克斯感到十分担忧。美国这些伎俩与中国比起来真的是差太远了。注意这不是我说的，是萨克斯后面一部分的内容。
China went from being a very poor country to a quite developed country in 40 years, and for 1.4 billion people. So this is the biggest single change in the world economy in a very, very long time. And it is the first time, well, Japan was the only case for a long time of an Asian country that achieved even industrialization. But this is something different. Now, East Asia is a powerhouse economically, and China is, of course, with nearly 20% of the world population, and with an economy that is, depending on measurements in purchasing power terms, bigger than the US in absolute size, and in market prices, smaller than the US, but in either event, a major economy. This is something new in the world. It's a good thing overall for the world because China went from poverty to development, and China in 2,000 years has played a major role in world civilization, and I'm glad to see China back on its feet. The reason China was so poor is part of this story. They call it the Century of Humiliation. China made one terrible mistake, the worst economic mistake of any country in all of world history that I know of. And that was in 1433. So 600 years ago, they stopped their naval fleet and they became an inward-looking country. And then 350 years after that, suddenly Great Britain started knocking on the door and China realized we're behind. And then in 1839, Britain launched the war for the freedom to export opium to China. Mind-boggling. So the opium wars are the opium wars for a reason, which is gangsterism, which was a large part of the British Empire. And from 1839 to 1949, it was complete disaster for China. 2 opium wars, the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, Civil War, Japanese invasion, Civil War. So by 1949, China was completely impoverished from having been a world civilization for 2 millennia, impoverished. China then, without a long story, the first decades were complicated, but starting in 1978, probably the greatest economic reform in history of scale took hold under Deng Xiaoping with the opening of China. And in 4 decades, China went from impoverishment to a highly innovative, dynamic economy. The big problem, in quotation marks, from the US point of view, is they became powerful, but not under our supervision. The Americans have the audacity to say, we believed that they would become a liberal democracy like us if they developed, but that failed, so now we have to confront them. That's the American mindset.
他如数家珍地描述我们的中国历史，让我听得一愣一愣的。不熟悉中国历史的国人，似乎也有些汗颜了。然后他还道出了中国曾经最关键性的问题，那是从1433年开始的闭关锁国的政策。鸦片战争开始，中国不无奈应战，他称英国为黑帮，这是为了贩卖鸦片的自由而发动的战争。我不清楚那些知道这段历史的美国人和欧洲人，他们是怎么理解这个问题的？这里的善恶很明显如果非要从另一个方面来理解鸦片战争那么这个人要么是愚蠢，要么是真的坏。你们觉得呢？好，最精彩的一段来了这下面一段呢，也可以让我们增长不少见识。那我就知道以后如何与其他人讨论这个问题了
It's a little ignorant because China's statecraft, centralized state, is not about the People's Republic of China or the Communist Party of China. It started in 221 BC. Centralized state. It started with the Han Empire. So this is a long story. Americans don't care, don't understand it. Now, your question is, what does it mean for China and the world? If we have peace, which I'm counting on because I can't imagine the alternative, I hope and look forward to China being a highly prosperous, dynamic, outward-looking country that is a pillar of the international system. I would like Europe and China to have good relations and to deal with each other. China will not be a democracy in the form of European parliamentary democracy. It will have its own statecraft. There will be imperfections like there are anywhere. It's not our business other than to have good discussion about different options and so forth, but we should have good relations with China. We should work together. We should analyze common problems. We should say, you have wisdom of 2,000 years. What would Confucius say about this? What would deep Chinese values say about this? It sounds silly, but I think it's a very serious point. I'm hosting a meeting in Athens of Confucian and Aristotelian scholars because I want to know what both those philosophers, what their philosophies can add to our modern problem solving. I actually believe a lot because they teach us about order, virtue, basic human nature questions. So my view is engage with this remarkable civilization. Be thankful that it has escaped from poverty, that it is innovating. I'm grateful, for example, that Chinese scientists developed the most effective treatment for malaria that we have, from an ancient Chinese herbal treatment from Qinghua So, which we use the extract artemisinin, which is saving millions of lives every year in Africa and Southeast Asia because of what a Nobel laureate Chinese scientist developed of an ancient practice. Well, there's a lot of that can come. I was delighted. I mentioned yesterday that downstairs nearby on Gran Via, there's the Huawei building. Okay, I went to Huawei. My wife and I visited Huawei a couple of times. We went in 2019. Incredibly impressive. So impressive that the United States insisted on shutting them down. Why? Because they got better at 5G than any US company. That's why. And then the US said, well, they can spy on us. That's not the real answer. The real answer is if it's an American equipment, then the US can spy on me. If it's Huawei equipment, it's a lot harder for the US to spy on me. So the fact of the matter is the US just tried to shut down Huawei because they made beautiful, low-cost 5G systems for developing countries that were going to sweep the world. And so the US had to go threaten everybody. Don't do business with them. So this is the first Huawei store that I've seen in a long time. You wouldn't find anyone in the United States. But the point I'm making is let us engage constructively. And China has a huge amount to offer for the world. And if we engage, it's not going to take over the world. And by the way, aside from many other reasons why China's not going to take over the world, China's population is going to fall by about 400 million people in the next 80 years. China's going to become old. I kind of appreciate that these days more than I would have before. But I also really feel old people don't want to take over the world. They just want quiet, you know? We want peace. We want nice. And that, I think, is what China will want as well. Thanks.
这一段呢就非常有趣哈。中国历史上呢，的确是有中央集权国家的时代，那是从公元前2211年的汉代开始的。而现在的中国呢，中华人民共和国完全不是嘛，中国的政党也不是嘛。如果将这混为一团，他认为是无知的表现。他强烈呼吁，我们不能够忽略中国深邃的价值观，2000多年的智慧啊，关于秩序、美德、基本的人性问题。非凡的文明让中国在创新中摆脱了贫困。然后呢，还谈到了青蒿素提取方法的贡献，还有华为的5G， 这些在中国当然是家喻户晓的，但从美国人的口中说出来，我们还是觉得比较新鲜，对不对？也让我们认识到，美国打击华为的行径其恶劣意图其实是昭然天下的。最后他说的这些呢，我觉得他的意思是指中国有很悠久的历史， 一路走过来，就像一个老人经历了很多，所以对很多东西啊看得很淡了，而不是那些毛头小子总喜欢打打杀杀，总想要更多的权利。现代的中国只想安安静静的发展自己，才不想接管世界呢。对啊，我们大多数中国人就是这么想的嘞，至少我是啊。好，有关萨克斯在GATE中心智库会议上的发言呢，我们到这里呢就全部介绍完了，希望对各位有帮助。我是复旦道宾，谢谢你的关注，再见。